Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 10th of March. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information at weather.gov or NOAA Weather Radio or your Marine VHF channel. You can give us a call on the weather info line at 800-472-0391. Find us on the internet, of course, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. During the afternoon, you'll be able to find your daily afternoon map briefing at NWS Anchorage and NWS Fairbanks, or simply search for AKwx TV. At the end of the day, following this broadcast in the evening, you can watch the complete Alaska weather show. Now, during Facebook today, we've shared some interesting imagery from things like this, a climate.gov post earlier today, talking about the lack of snow cover. Now, if you're in Fairbanks, you already know the results of this. If you're in southern Alaska, you already know the results of this. But nevertheless, this is a very telling picture to talk about considering what's been going on. Along the historic Iditarod Trail, you know, of course, that the dogs like to start running around Anchorage, and then they restart up around Willow, and then that takes you through a lot of these gray patches. Each one of these gray patches is an area of snow that's less than a foot right now of ground cover. Well, with the race now taking shape from Fairbanks toward Nome, you can see that crosses through many more of these bluer colors, places that there's considerably more snow, 2, 3, even 4 or more feet. They're especially west of Galena into the eastern Norton Sound coastline and then out around Nome, where there's been plenty of snow lately. So a big impact again from this very warm winter for many, especially in southern Alaska, is pretty noticeable this week by many across the nation and, of course, the rest of the world there. So something interesting to look at. If you'd like to read more about this, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/NWS Alaska, and you should be able to pull that up on your mobile device fairly easily as well, even if you're on a cell plan. And what you should be able to do is read out the details of why some of these things have happened this year, specifically in the last month to month and a half that set such a warm note to the February record books there. So again, information on our Facebook page, and you can find more about that on other social media channels as well as weather.gov/Alaska. Again, the snow depth report across southern Alaska noticeably lacking this year, as evidenced by where the dogs are running this season. Here's a look out to the west now, and you can see several waves of low pressure. High pressure is in charge across the central and western Aleutians right now, and that's moving eastward. We've got more of a north and westerly flow moving across the central and eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, but out to the west, a new wave of low pressure is working in from the south. With that, we'll start to see some relatively weak gales, it looks like, moving across the western chain in the coming days. In the meantime, the cold flow continues working out of the Bering Strait and the northern Bering Sea. Many areas with the lack of ice there will be seeing the opportunity for some heavy freezing spray. That should last through Wednesday. So if you're south of St. Matthew and Nunivak Island and the open waters here, of course, you'll be dealing with some gusty winds and probably the opportunity for that spray to set in. As we look across the mainland of Alaska, we also have pretty quiet weather across the Gulf of Alaska. A little bit of a change from what we've seen a lot of the season, but there is some replacement weather to move in fairly quickly. With that southerly flow moving into the central and eastern Gulf, we expect warmer air to build into south and eastern Alaska through the remainder of the mid to late week. With that comes an opportunity for more rain, and the wind should probably pick up a little bit more from the south and southeast. So look for some changes coming your way in the coming days. In the meantime, across most of Alaska, what we're looking at is just cold air showing up on the satellite picture at this point, with the infrared satellite picture sensing a lot of that cold ground. You can see a little movement here across the northwest. That may be a few fair weather clouds, but more often than not, it's just a clear sky and very chilly temperatures that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. Many places around the interior, we're looking at temperatures below 20, even 30 below in the last night or so. Here's a look at low pressure and the map there across the northern Gulf at 1,013 millibars, showing a trough extending into the Susitna Valley and northward. High pressure sitting up across the northern Yukon is kind of being attacked a little bit by a wave of low pressure across the Yukon. This will fall apart and move away. High pressure sitting up across the northern slope at 1,035 millibars. We have another part of that ridge out across the western chain. And then a trough working through the central and eastern Aleutians, helping to spark off a brief snow shower there around St. George this afternoon. But I struggled to find any other place in Alaska that was reporting any precipitation around 2 to 3 o'clock this afternoon. It just wasn't happening. The air is pretty dry across many places. Now, as we get into tonight, that may change a little bit. With warmer air working northward toward Haida Gwaii, we may start to see some periods of rain and snow mix into the Clarence Strait region around Hyder, all the way out toward Craig and Klawock. Probably not making it a whole lot further than that by tomorrow morning. The trough of low pressure across south central moves a little bit further to the east. There could be some spotty snow showers around the Barren Islands and the north and eastern side of Kodiak Island. Most probably won't see that unless you're closer to the coastline. Out across the Bering Sea and west of the Pribilof, some snow showers developing there along the wave of a trough that's moving through the Bering. And we could see a few areas of light snow around Adak, perhaps up to an inch there, and across the north and eastern coastline of the Alaska Peninsula. High pressure still in charge of the north. You'll see some clouds around the middle Yukon Valley. For many, more often than not, it's just going to be cold. There won't be a whole lot going on underneath that cloud cover. As we get into Wednesday, more of the same for the interior. Really pretty quiet for most places. It is going to be cold, but trail conditions still look to be pretty optimal, especially considering the route taken this year. Out across the west, a trough of low pressure across the central Bering, spotty snow showers around St. Matthew and the Pribilofs. Snow showers still possible across the central and eastern chain, and maybe rain mixed with snow out across the west as some of that warmer air is working up the western side of high pressure. Out across the eastern Gulf, low pressure is up to 999 millibars now. That warmer weather is lifting northward, and with that a rain and snow mix may be lifting northward as well into the Lynn Canal. Most of the precipitation that should be steady will be a little bit further south, and that looks like it will fall in the form of rain at this point. Snow showers around the Barrens once again on the north and eastern side of Kodiak Island, perhaps mixing in with a little bit of rain the further south it goes. Most in south central and around the Alaska Range will be dry and sunny. Northward, you're looking at a few more clouds around the Yukon Valley. As we get into Thursday, even that starts to fall apart with drier weather setting in from the north and the east. Many will see sunshine from Fairbanks all the way out to Norton Sound, and that means it will be a very bright day on this year's historic Iditarod Trail. Out across the west, low pressure continues to work in across the Bering Sea, slow and sure as high pressure is trying to hold it back once again. The triple point of low pressure working across Kiska at 1,003 millibars will likely spread in a little bit of rain, maybe mixed with snow toward the end of the day, but it's still running into some colder air. So at this point, that looks to be probably more snow than anything else. Snow showers again in the same old places around Kodiak Island and the Barrens. It looks like low pressure is working northward, and as it nears Yakutat, it'll be a better chance that any precipitation falling across the southeast will mainly be in the form of rain. As you get further north toward Haines and Skagway and a little bit higher up the hill, that will start to mix in with some snow, and you'll see a chance for some light snow there just across the Alcan around the Wrangell-St. Elias region and perhaps just south of Tok. Most other places are going to be dry in the mainland of Alaska, and it looks like most of the clouds are falling apart. For areas north and east of Bethel, you'll see a better chance for a partly to mostly cloudy sky, but from Nome to Fairbanks, conditions look to be pretty bright, a little bit on the cold side though. Here's a look at temperatures this afternoon, and you can see the cold that has been setting in across the interior. We'll get to that in just a moment. Let's look at southeast quickly. Mid to upper 30s for many from Petersburg southward, upper 30s, even lower 40s there around the Clarence Strait and Dixon entrance. 37 around Sitka, 34 for Gustavus, 30 around Juneau today, Haines and Skagway in the upper 20s, about the same there in Yakutat at 27. Prince William Sound was in the teens and 20s today, a little bit cooler there around Portage. 23 around Homer, 17 for Kenai, 14 in Anchorage, even with full sunshine today, 15 around Talkeetna. Healy and Greeley were showing temperatures sub-zero today. Fairbanks was 7 below. Tanana was looking at 16 below, 2 below in Fort Yukon. Looking further north still, you can see the cold across the north slope, anywhere from 25 to 35 below. Atkasuk and Wainwright, one of the colder spots today. Kaktovik, not as bad at 15 below. Barrow was 23 below. Kivalina was showing 16 below, Kotzebue 14 below. Shishma back on the map today, it's 18 below. Nome was sitting at 7 below as they prepare for the return of the dogs and mushers. 9 below for Unalakleet. Galena was 10 below. And then once you get south of the Yukon, conditions warm up just a little bit, noticeably so in McGrath at 5 below, 4 below in Bethel. Nunivak Island was 3 above, 2 below in St. Lawrence Island. And looking further south still into the Bristol Bay region, single digits and low teens for Dillingham and King Salmon. Cape Newenham was 5 above. Pribilof's holding in the lower 20s. The Alaska Peninsula, anywhere from the lower to mid-20s there. Sandpoint, 27, 30 in Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, 32 in Adak. Atka was 36, and Shemya showed 32. Now, overnight low temperatures across the interior and the west coast and the Seward Peninsula and the North Slope will all run between 25 and about 35 below. And if there's a little bit of a breeze, plan on an additional wind chill, at least of 10 to 15 degrees. Now, most cases, it looks like the winds won't be moving along that much, so what you see is pretty much what you get tonight. Look for the Bristol Bay region to hold closer to 0. Teens and 20s for the Alaska Peninsula. The Aleutians still holding around freezing, if not just a hair below. Southeast will be in the 20s and 30s there. Coastal areas in the lower to mid-30s there, all the way down into places like Ketchikan and Annette. Prince William Sound will drop into the teens tonight. Temperatures hovering close to 0 around Anchorage. Fairbanks 23 below. Tanana 29 below, and a little bit further west toward Galena, about 23 below. High temperatures tomorrow will close in on 0. Conditions will be a little bit warmer than they were today, it looks like. 3 below in Nome, 1 above in Bethel, low to mid-teens for Southwest and Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, you're looking at 33. Anywhere from 20 to about 25 below for the North Slope. Kivalina and Kotzebue looking at about 10 below for tomorrow. Northway and Eagle should hover close to 0, maybe on either side of it. Prince William Sound in the teens and 20s, and Southeast again in the 30s and 40s. Some of the warmer spots will be Craig and Klawock into the mid-40s. Here's your flying weather, and notice that that warm and wet air is bringing visibility and ceilings down a little bit more tomorrow. IFR conditions should spread north of Haida Gwaii by the end of the day. Out across the west, MVFR conditions for some parts of the west coast and the northern Yukon Delta. But if you're flying between Fairbanks and Nome tomorrow and following the dogs and the mushers, conditions look pretty good for visibility, so we shouldn't have too many concerns there. Let's check your pass conditions, though. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass look to be both VFR tomorrow. Smooth sailing for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, VFR conditions there, and for Rainy Pass as we go into your Wednesday. Windy Pass looks fine, VFR conditions expected there, and for Isabel Pass. Mentasta Pass we're going to call VFR. Tanita Pass should also be visual throughout the day. Portage Pass looks to be VFR, and as we get around to Chilkoot and White Pass, expect visual flight rule to continue there for northern parts of Southeast. Freezing levels as you would expect with the latest round of colder air dropping southward. The surface freezing line has moved back toward the central and eastern Aleutians, even south of Kodiak Island. Here comes our next round of warmer air up the east coast and the southeastern parts of the Gulf. Those levels as high as 2,000 to 4,000 feet by early tomorrow morning. That will continue working northward. As we check on the freezing potential and the icing potential, there's really not a whole lot of room for icing for most of the general aviation concerns there across the Yukon Valley, across Southwest, across the Alaska Range. The needed moisture is probably around Haida Gwaii and just north of the Dixon entrance by tomorrow afternoon. Most of that will be above about 5,000 feet and remain light to isolated moderate. So anything else will just be isolated and passing at this point. The jet stream shows that our cold weather will continue with low pressure up across the Arctic Ocean, northwesterly flow moving off of eastern Asia and Siberia. We have a trough extending across the west coast and down into the northern Pacific. On the south side of that is southwesterly flow that's moving the weather along into the Pacific Northwest with wind speeds between 50 and 100 knots. But our main weather pattern right now is bringing us that colder, much drier northwesterly flow into more parts of Alaska than we've seen in recent weeks. So enjoy the cold. It certainly is a last gasp of winter, at least as it looks like right now. Here's the 9,000-foot winds, and you can see low pressure sitting across the northern end of the Susitna Valley. That is also working with that northwesterly flow, bringing the cold to the Alaska Peninsula. A ridge of high pressure south of Kiska and Attu is bringing the northerly winds across the central chain and the Pribilofs, with wind speeds there between 20 and 30 knots. Winds are fairly strong across the eastern side of the Gulf right now, up to 55 knots, but slow down considerably as they move along the Alcan and certainly north across the middle and upper Yukon Valley and the Brooks Range, only 5 to 10 knots there. High pressure is also steering the winds and slowing them down across the eastern Brooks Range. Look for 15-knot winds on the north and south side of the ridge for the Arctic coast. So wind speeds at the surface are also noticeably slow. You'll see that in the marine weather section here in just a little while. I'll give you a hint, only 5 to 10 knots tops for many. North and easterly winds moving across the lower and middle Yukon Valley around 20 knots or so, 30 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. And high pressure is also in charge for the central chain, with much stronger winds on the western side, 10 to about 50 knots there, ramping up very quickly as you get out toward Kiska and Attu, with 50-knot winds continuing into the western Bering. As far as turbulence goes, there may still be some chop. We have that north and westerly flow cutting through the capes and some of the passes there across the peninsula, across Bristol Bay and the western capes, and also across the eastern sections of the central chain. If you're going to find that, it's going to likely be below 5,000 feet. A little bit higher up for the western Aleutians and out across areas closer to the eastern Kamchatka Peninsula coastline. That again could be below 10,000 feet. And with the wind starting to pick up across southeastern Alaska, I went ahead and drew in some occasional moderates. Some of that might be a little bit further north than what's going to probably develop in the afternoon, but I'd say south of Sitka and into the Dixon entrance below 7,000 feet, you may start to run into a little bit more chop as you go throughout the day. This will continue working northward through Wednesday. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with a look at the sea ice edge, of course, and the update there, as well as your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Now it's only emergency personnel should go outside.
Several times in the early 1990s, residents of Anchorage, Alaska awakened to a remarkable weather forecast. Volcanic ash ending this morning, turning sunny this afternoon. The city and much of southern Alaska had been plunged into darkness, shrouded in a cloud of volcanic ash as Mount Spur erupted to the west.
Anybody that has to go outside, I recommend that you cover your face with a scarf or mask.
Ash was everywhere. It settled on sidewalks, rooftops, cars. Any movement set the ash back into the air. The volume of volcanic activity in Alaska was suddenly on display.
Over half of all earthquakes that occur in the United States occur in Alaska. Over half of all volcanoes in the United States are in Alaska. We get 1 to 2 volcanic eruptions a year on average.
The Earth's crust is composed of moving plates, which continually change the landscape of Alaska.
What's happening here is that you have to get into the plate tectonics. The Pacific plate is moving underneath the North American plate here, subducting.
Yes.
And as the plate comes along and then it goes down underneath the North American plate. So we have what we call a plate boundary, a plate margin. At a certain point, as it gets down there, the materials melt again and come up, and that's where you get volcanic arcs.
Though many of the volcanoes are in extremely remote locations, there's a huge concern about public safety, and for good reason.
Aviation and volcanic ash don't mix at all. The big hazard in Alaska from volcanoes comes from the ash. We do have probably 20,000 people or more a day are flying above these volcanoes. The millions of pounds of cargo, air cargo going back and forth. In 1989, Mount Redoubt erupted. Mount Redoubt is a volcano here in Cook Inlet. About 50 miles or so to the north over the Talkeetna Mountains, a 747 flew into the ash cloud. So it wasn't even flying into it right over the volcano, it was quite a ways away. Flew into it and all 4 engines flamed out. They fell for about 4 minutes approximately, I don't remember the exact, before they were able to restart the engines and then land safely in Anchorage.
That close call with disaster led to the creation of the Alaska Volcano Observatory in Anchorage, which now operates sensors on scores of active volcanoes.
What we're looking at here are the 24-hour records from various seismometers that we have out in the Aleutians.
Within an hour of the massive Sumatra earthquake which set up the deadly Asian tsunami, the mountains here in Alaska began to shake.
After the Landers earthquake occurred in '92, this is a Southern California earthquake. It was a magnitude 7 something. It lit up the entire U.S. West Coast with little micro earthquakes. And so it was a big revolution in the seismology community, because this is the only natural case we have where we know exactly what triggers an earthquake. And that's why it's so important, is because it gives us something that we can test. We know that these ground motions from the Sumatra earthquake on December 26 triggered these smaller ones. And so it gives us something to get our teeth into about what actually nucleates earthquakes. So that's why it's so exciting.
The link was headline news in the Anchorage Daily News. Sumatra quake sent shivers through Alaska's Mount Wrangell volcano.
Tom, what we have in mind,
Yes.
depart Golcana.
Yes.
We'll be climbing from about 1,500 feet to 45.
We wanted to see the volcano for ourselves. Was it still active? There was only one way to find out. Wrangell St. Elias National Park manager Will Tipton, who's also a veteran pilot, was the perfect person to give us a first-hand view.
It's big. That's what defines Wrangell St. Elias. It's huge, and it has huge wild wilderness qualities about it.
As is so often the case in Alaska, the only way to get into the state's more remote areas is by air.
Yeah. Wow.
13.2 million acres. 60% of the ice in Alaska is found right here, Wrangell St. Elias National Park. We have 9 of the 16 highest peaks in North America right here. We have the second tallest peak, second to Denali, of course.
Weather dictates where you go here. No wonder there's so much ice. You constantly work around clouds in this part of the world. But the mountains which shook were ever present.
We have an active volcano, Mount Wrangell, that we flew close to today. Last erupted about 1900. It may erupt again and undoubtedly will.
But one Alaska eruption was like no other.
Novoruptor at Katmai area eruption in 1912 is the largest volcanic eruption in the last century anywhere in the world.
Its force was at least 10 times that of Mount St. Helens, and the scars it left are visible today. When we come back, we'll visit the site where almost a century later, people are still talking about the mammoth volcanic eruption.
All I heard her mention was that they prayed a lot.
With a recent warm spell across the Aleutians, the Alaska Peninsula, we can see that the ice edge has retreated in the recent week or so. However, grease ice is forming fairly quickly across many areas along that ice edge there, so we expect to see a little more growth, especially with a northerly wind coming out across the northern Bering and through the Bering Strait. We're also seeing additional ice forming across Cook Inlet there with the recent cold weather. So winter is not over yet, despite what we may have seen with that snow depth report just a little while ago. And according to the sea ice map there, more winter is on the way with that northerly flow expanding the ice at least fairly quickly across that leading ice edge. So pay attention to this map. It's sure to change. Weather.gov/Anchorage/ice.php is the place to go for the latest information there, as well as the 5-day outlook there as presented by our Alaska Sea Ice Desk team. Here's a look at the forecast now for southeastern Alaska. Northerlies also working through the Lynn Canal as we go through Wednesday, up to 35 knots in the northern Lynn Canal. 7-foot seas are expected there. Those northerlies continue down through Stevens Passage and Frederickstown. The southeasterly flow through the Clarence Strait at 30 knots with a 6-foot sea. Higher gusts may be seen as far east as Yakutat and will extend westward up toward the Copper River Delta region. Northeasterlies also flowing offshore out of Cross Sound, 25 knots there, continuing down toward Dixon Entrance, also at 25 knots with 8-foot seas the further south you go. For Thursday, expect to see the northerlies still going strong for some areas along the coast, but you're going to see those westerlies and southerlies start to move northward throughout the day. So watch for the change there as that warm front is working northward through southeast, also bringing rain, of course, and lower visibility. Southerlies will move back into the Lynn Canal with 35 knots with a 7-foot sea. South and southeasterly winds also working through the southern intercoastal waterways at 25 to 35 knots with 5 to 7-foot seas. And you're going to notice those gales working northward with an offshore flow around Cross Sound. Southerlies parallel to the coast, 26, 25-foot seas there as south of Sitka. And northerlies opposing that on the northern side of that front. You'll still have 25 knots coming in with a 14-foot sea outside of Yakutat and Icy Cape. Now, as we get into south central, northerlies blowing across Prince William Sound about 10 to 15 knots, stronger outside of Montague Island and the entrance, of course. Higher gusts there once again around the Copper River Delta. North and easterly winds coming down Cook Inlet. Once again, encouraging some of that ice growth, depending on how fast the winds are, of course. That could be slower or faster. Northwesterlies coming across the Barrens. Watch for freezing spray in many of these locations. The north and northwesterly winds coming across Kodiak Island with seas around 6 to 8 feet on either side, including Shelikof Strait. North and northwesterly winds will still be the rule as we get into Thursday, about 10 to 20 knots inside of Cook Inlet. Winds up to 40 knots there on the western side of the Barrens with an 11-foot sea. Northerlies inside of Prince William Sound, a little bit stronger on the outside in the north and western Gulf. 25 to 35 knots are expected. About the same there on the eastern side of Kodiak Island with 11-foot seas, 7-foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait for Thursday. For the Alaska Peninsula, northerlies inside of Bristol Bay with a 5-foot sea. Heavy freezing spray is possible across many parts of the southern Bering and the coastal areas there, so watch for that. 30 knots north of Cold Bay with a 7-foot sea, and from Castle Cape all the way down toward King Cove and Falls Pass, 30 knots with a 9 to 11-foot sea possible there. Thursday, northerlies continue on the Bering Sea coast, 25 knots with a 6 to 7 foot sea, 30 to 35 knots on the Pacific coast with 11 to 12 foot seas around the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday. For Wednesday, southerlies are building in across the western chain, 35 knots with a 9-foot sea. North and easterly winds continue for the central and eastern chain. Most areas running around 30 knots there, the exception being Kiska, with 12 to 13-foot seas on the Bering Sea coast and 12 to 15-foot seas along the Pacific coast. By Thursday, you start to see a little more of a change with that southerly flow taking shape across the central and even eastern sections of the chain. Around Unalaska on the eastern end of the island, more of a north and westerly flow, 7-foot seas there from Nikolsky eastward. Pacific coast looking at 11-foot seas. Otherwise, it's 6 to 8-foot seas around the central chain and the Bering Sea coast, 11 to 13-foot seas for the Pacific, and 13 to 15-foot seas out in the west, still holding around 30 knots or so. For the west coast, northerlies coming down the coast. There may be some additional gusts around the capes. Look for a northerly flow around St. Matthew Island waters, 3-foot seas there, up to 6-foot seas around the Pribilofs, and once again, heavy freezing spray could be an issue. For Thursday, northerlies still coming down from St. Lawrence Island, 15 to as high as 25 knots. Northerlies around the Pribilofs down to 15 knots, and an easterly flow now for St. Matthew. 6-foot seas expected there across the central and western Bering. Winds are going to be pretty light across the Beaufort Sea coast. Look for northerlies coming into the Kotzebue Sound region, 10 to 20 knots on Wednesday. And that's going to hold for Thursday as well. Most areas across the northern coast anywhere from 5 to 10 knots from the west and southwest. And look for more of an easterly flow, light north of Kaktovik, only around 5 knots. Nice to catch a break from time to time, isn't it? Here's a look at what's going on for the rest of the state as we go into tonight. More clouds than anything else for areas north of the Yukon and the central interior. High pressure sitting across the Arctic coast at 1,035 millibars. Warm air is lifting up across the eastern Gulf. That will start to spread rain and some areas of mixed precipitation across the southern intercoastal waterways and areas south of Port Alexander as we get into tonight and tomorrow. Otherwise, it's light snow for Adak and many areas, just seeing snow showers there. That trend will continue to focus on the chain and wet weather across southeast, with most across mainland Alaska looking fairly dry and just cold for the interior as we go into Thursday. Snow showers in southern coastal areas of south central. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.